Okay, just a tiny bit more about terminology. Again, some of this is related to anatomy and some of it is not, but it's so easy for people to conflate terminology that I want to make sure that at least we take this opportunity to address this terminology. Okay, so sex, gender, sexual orientation, what these things have to do with one another, what actually exists in the population, even if you have never encountered it. So, as far as the sexes go, there are male, of course, typical anatomical male, typical anatomical female, and then intersex individuals. And intersex individuals are individuals whose internal or external anatomical structures developed somewhere between a typical anatomical male and a typical anatomical female. So this is like anatomical ambiguity, in which, for instance, the glans clitoris is larger and might have the urethra within it, which is usually more typical of a penis. Or the internal ductwork is somewhere in between the typical anatomical male and female. Like you have a blind vagina, but you got no uterus. Everyone started out with a blind vagina. So that concept is called intersex, okay? And it absolutely, absolutely exists, and there's a tremendous amount of variability. And then let's talk about genders a little bit. And by the way, this figure is kind of fantastic. It's showing you all of the complexities of determining sex, and then gender and how it's related, all of these different anatomical and genetic differences that exist in humans. And I'll post this one for you too, because I think it's really interesting. So much more than I've ever actually even encountered in my genetics training. There's more than I knew, not surprisingly. So like typical anatomical female, typical anatomical male, and then a whole bunch of things in between that. Okay, and then gender, again, is not an anatomical term, but there are relationships that we can identify and use in relationship to the anatomy. So you probably, or maybe not, have heard the terms cisgender and transgender before. So this is an individual's sense of identifying with the same or a different gender identification than the anatomic or assigned sex. So if I have typical female anatomy and gender identify as female, then I would be considered cisgender. If, however, I had typical female anatomy and gender identified as male, I would be transgender. So gender aligns with psychological determination independent of sex determination. And there are absolutely situations in which the anatomic sex and the gender identity do not agree, and have been historically as well. And then last but not least, again, not directly related to what we're talking about, but so easy to conflate that it's worth actually talking about. So what about sexual orientation? What does it have to do with this story? Well, it doesn't directly have to do with this story at all, but again, the terminology is used inexactly, even by me, and you can hear me kind of struggling to make sure I'm using the correct terminology, because I was taught sort of an incorrect terminology, so I'm working on it. So what is sexual orientation? This is a separate issue than sex or gender. And male, female, or intersex individuals, transgender, cisgender individuals can fall anywhere along the spectrum of sexual orientation. This is the Kinsey scale. It was done in 1948. It's been updated a couple times. It is really only a starting point, and I'm not saying to you that this is the end-all be-all of the science. But there have been studies since then that look at the spectrum that exists in people's sexual orientation from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, acknowledging that this is not really broad enough to include intersex individuals necessarily, or individuals who are transgender. But this is a starting point. And one of the things that the Kinsey study found out is that, first of all, your sexual orientation, what you're attracted to, not what you identify as, changes at different points in your life, and that fewer people than you imagine identify as exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual. And of course, when they first did this, they did not put asexual as a possibility, but now we know that asexual is actually a possibility for sexual orientation. So again, this is not stuff that I will be discussing as we go through, but maybe it's the first time anyone's ever tried to identify this terminology with you, so maybe it's useful. Okay.